So welcome back, everyone. We have the privilege of having Dr. Scott Masson back on the channel. For those of you that didn't watch our interview on Canada, he's an associate professor in English literature at Toronto University in Toronto, or at Tyndale University in Toronto, Canada. He teaches on subjects ranging from literature of the Greco-Roman period, the Bible as literature, Shakespeare, Milton, 17th century literature, romantic literature, the work of Lewis, Tolkien, science fiction, practical criticism, and classical and contemporary literary theory. Thanks for coming on the channel today, Scott.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be back.
So, my understanding is you became a Christian as an adult. Do you mind walking through, before you became a Christian, some of the influences that made you interested in Christianity?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm older now, so I see things a little differently than I at the time when I was younger. So I'll look at myself. So I grew up going to church. I went to a United Church, which is the largest Protestant denomination in Canada, but it's what we would call a liberal mainline church. And it didn't have any real effect on me. But it was just the context of growing up in Canada that you went to church um, in the 70s. And it was just the thing that one did. And I did get even did the what do we call it, confirmation when I was 12, 13 or something like that. But as I say, I it had no significant effect on me. I went to for my undergrad to a college in Canada called Huron College in my hometown. It was an Anglican college, and I studied English and history. But in my first year class in English, I studied Milton's Paradise Lost, and it gave an account of the fall of mankind in it. And I have to say that I found the whole account powerful and even overwhelming. And I couldn't grasp the richness of the cultural background that he brought into the text. There's a lot of classical allusions and rich theological framing of the discussion and so forth. And it was a bit over my head, quite frankly, but I knew that I wanted to know more. And I also had a decided sense that what he was saying, despite all the literary elements, was true. And I wanted to know more about that. Uh, and I have to say that that first year class changed my life in some ways because of the stance of the professor in it, because she said to us, if you really want to understand Milton's Paradise Lost, you need to read the Genesis account. You also need to read Revelation 12, and then here are a few passages you need to. And she said, in general, though, if you want to study English literature, you need to read the Bible. And the class, I can tell you, did not respond very well to that. And they were sort of some, that sort of mocking comment. She didn't leave that alone. She turned on the class and said, I heard that and I can see that there's an attitude issue here. She said, you realize that you've come to a place of higher learning. And when you come to a place of higher learning, one of the things that we first learn is that we don't dismiss things we know nothing about. And I suspect that most of you know nothing about this. So before you judge something as unworthy of your consideration beneath you as a civilized person, maybe you want to read it and then you can be part of the discussion here. But until you do that, you're just ignorant. And so that had a powerful effect on me, I have to say. I was not one of the mockers, but I certainly would not have made it such a robust defense of reading scripture. And so I took her seriously and I tried to do that. And as I say, my studies moved me more and more in the theological direction. That's as an undergraduate, but I was not a Christian. I was serious about my studies and I pushed in that direction. And I wanted to be a medievalist like C.S. Lewis. Now, I encountered C.S. Lewis. I had never read the Narnia Chronicles. I read none of his apologetics works. I read him as a literary critic, medievalist, and I loved his stuff. I thought there's something profound and deep here. And so when I left, I got my undergrad degree, I went to Toronto to the Center for Medieval Studies and asked them what I should do to be a medievalist. And they said, you need to study languages. Latin, German, French, whatever, you need ancient modern languages. And I thought, oh my, this is a deep, um, that's a big project. But I moved to Europe to do that specifically. So I lived in Germany for 3 years, and I had the opportunity there to study German and also classical languages. I discovered that I was really good at languages. I didn't know that. I did all right in them, but I didn't think I was really good. But I discovered I was actually quite good at it. And after 3 years, though, the reason that I had wanted to study medieval literature was not for the literature per se, but that I found Christ in the literature. It was the center of the whole way of looking at the world. And that world that was in the literature was built and centered around Christ. That was just plainly there. And I wanted that center for myself. But I found myself in Germany with the languages now, but no Christ. And I realized in talking that I needed that. And that's why I was there to begin with. So rather than stay in Germany, where I was by that point pretty established and I could have done well, I decided I was going to go back to find Christ. And you would have thought I would go to a church, right? I mean, but it didn't occur to me because my background in the church was not remotely attractive. For whatever reason, I'm blaming myself as much as anything because I remember thinking that people in churches were hypocrites, being one of my thoughts and the reasons I didn't like church. But at that age, one of the things that I recall thinking is that I was too. I also, because I'd lived long enough and seen that I said certain things, I acted certain ways, but actually I contradicted in my behavior the things that I said. I had a very high view of myself. I'm very principled, whatever. And I think, well, actually, no, I also do those things. So anyway, I wanted Christ. I didn't even bother going into a church, but then I went to England to study medieval literature. So I moved to Durham, northeast of England. I know this is a long story, but and I went there to study medieval literature. But the medievalist was on sabbatical. The Renaissance specialist, I think she had some sort of a health issue. Another person was not there, and I could not study medieval or Renaissance literature. I ended up studying Romantic literature, which is the period where things totally move away from the Christian worldview. It's the Enlightenment, and the Romantic period is a total shift. Now, I don't want to study that. That's going totally away from the thing that I came here to do. Anyway, I did well enough and got full funding for a doctorate in Durham. And so in one sense, I'd been successful, but I was not there for the reason I came there. Well, that summer, between my master's and PhD, I met in a conversation at a pub someone who was a Christian about to enter her studies in medieval literature there in Durham, and she was defending the Christian faith in the pub against a bunch of lecturers there who were they were mocking her.
Mm-hmm.
But she was holding her own, and I found myself on her side, for reasons that are probably clear by now.
Right.
And she invited me to her church, and I was like, okay. So I think a few weeks later, maybe a month later, I went to her church. And then when I heard the preaching, and I was just like, this is what this is a moment. I actually had a sense when I even met her that this is, and now with hindsight, this is providential. There's something happening here that is not just your normal day. Something important has happened. And then going to the church even more so. And I went to that church regularly for a period of time. And I realized that this is why God had brought me to this place at this particular time. So between my master's and PhD, that's when I converted, after I'd received the funding. And then I had to rethink what it meant to be an academic as a Christian in the context of a secular university where those thoughts were not particularly encouraged. They were traditional, but they weren't really considered to be defensible or legitimate. And I did not agree at all. I thought they were entirely legitimate and central to the problem of what I was seeing was happening in academia, which is that the humanities were falling apart, destroying themselves from within in the realms of literary theory. That was the full frontal assault. Now, my supervisor was a literary theorist, a deconstructionist, in fact, whom I regard highly. He's a very bright man, and I liked his critique of other literary theories, but I also was not a deconstructionist. And so he and we started off on a similar page, and gradually I realized that there was a gulf there that could not be breached. And so that was a bit difficult, but he was such a good man that the disagreement was not enough to throw me under the bus, which might have happened in many universities these days. Like if you go against the party line, they're not interested in supporting you, but he supported me. But eventually I had to go my own path there and defend my views in my doctoral thesis against I wouldn't say against his advice, in a path very different than the one he would have gone down.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided I was going to do that, and come what may. And there was a very real possibility that I would have failed the doctorate. That happens in the UK, and got nothing for it. But I thought it was
It was worth
worth
the risk.
it was worth the risk, and that I could defend it. I had a very high view of my own abilities. I no, really, I thought I can fight my corner, and you bring it on, and I will take you on. Okay, so in the doctoral defense, now this is something that I've told other people, and this is really interesting. I think I lost my voice leading up to the oral defense,
Mm.
which I've never done in my whole life and have never done since. But I lost it a week before. And in Britain, the oral defense is the exam. The examiners read it before, but then you have an oral defense, and if you fail that, you can go down. And I thought, okay, I've written things there. My examiners are not going to agree with it, and I'm going to be in a war.
Mm-hmm.
And then I lose my voice.
Wow.
Okay, so I go into and I had a little bit of it back by the time I went into the oral, but I thought I can't defend I can't speak well enough to be able to do this. So I walk into the room, and the head of the examination committee greeted me and said we're going to depart from convention here a little bit today. Um, and I think we're all in agreement that this is okay. The other guy agrees. He said, we're going to start by just sort of calming you down by telling that you've passed the defense. But we still have some questions for you. And I thought, you have no idea that I can't speak, and you've just passed me. And so I don't even care what questions you ask,
Right.
because you've already said you've got the thumbs up. And then I proceeded to hack and cough, and it was a very short oral defense, but they passed me. So what I learned from that was that uh, God was ahead of me on this, and he had me, and my trust in him was he was going to show me that he would vindicate that without me in some sense. I mean, it was with me, but in a sense, he brought that about. That's how I can. So I learned a lot from that experience in on a personal level um, of the risk that you take in situations, and I was rewarded for it. I don't know if it always works that way, but it did for me. It was a turning point.
So you became a Christian as an adult in academia. You have these notions of church that you've grown up with. You start going to a new church. You become a Christian. What were some ideas that you had maybe going into it that turned out not to be true, that you had about Christianity or even Christians? How did your perspective on church and Christianity change, especially during those early years?
So at first, when I'm sitting in the church, I'm sitting at the back, not wanting to. And it's a funny thing as a teacher now, I see people sitting at the back of the room. And those are the skeptics. They're like with the way they relate to the speaker, they're like, I'm not with you, but I'm not against you. I'm in the doors and I'm sitting here and I'm listening and I don't want anyone to talk to me. I don't want to be friendly. I'm sitting here and I want to be as if I'm uh able to run out the door if I want to. But I'm here and I'm listening. And I found that what I appreciated about the this particular church is that it was uh, expository in its preaching. It took the text, the biblical text, and then it exposited the text. It taught what was being taught in the text, and it did so in a very intelligent way. My intelligence was not insulted, and the man concerned was an Old Testament professor, so he had facility with the ancient languages, but he also had a literary sensibility. He'd been an English teacher before, actually, a high school English teacher, highly literate man. Um, and I found that one of my preconceptions was that Christians were not very intelligent, and that evangelicals, and it was an evangelical church, particularly, were not very intelligent. In fact, you had to put your brain outside the door when you came into the church, and that's how it was going to operate. I found it was the exact opposite of that. There was a very careful engagement with the text that was worthy of an academic, and at the same time was addressing issues that I know outs that in the academic realm were just verboten topics. We're not going to talk about those things. There was no-go area, and that was pretty much what was stated. There's no-go area in scripture. Even the most difficult passages, he went after those passages, and when he was preaching on it, he wouldn't leave that verse out, and he would directly raise the issue that was raised by that challenging text. And so there was integrity about it, and I just found this is liberating because by that point, remember, the 80s are political correctness is setting in, and it's even more so now. But back then, it's already, well, you don't really want to say that, and let's steer clear of those sensitive issues. We're not doing that. So there's a candor and an integrity and an intelligence about it, which I had not expected. And that really appealed to me, as you can imagine. The things that were challenging was, yeah, everything.
Mm. Yeah.
And that was also clearly said that when you come to faith, certain problems are solved in ways that are, you will not find solutions elsewhere. There's nothing like that. But certain problems come into existence that you never had anticipated before. And one of them was with the problem of your own sinfulness and the many ways that that played out in your life. So coming to faith isn't just a matter of, I believe this was true as a series of doctrinal statements that are transformative. I think that's part of it, but that was the easy bit for me. I was already being pulled that way by my whole life. I've like spent years studying to get to this point. So for me, this is, I've received the reward. Now everything makes sense. But since it's true, it means I have to live very differently. And now the problem begins because the Bible's view on sexual relations, monogamy, on problems of lust and money and power and wealth and all the stuff that literary theory talks about, those affect everybody and they affected me. So I needed to change. I needed to change my habits, my lifestyle, even my friends. My friends were not going to be in agreement with where I had landed. And I looked the same. And I wanted to act in a way because these are my friends. I don't want to act like they're my enemies.
Right. Right.
But they see that I'm distancing myself in my habits, the way I go about business, going out to the pubs and, the way I talk and all manner of things. They can see the change. And they say that they think, and wrongly, they think that it's against them, and it's not against
Mm.
them. I'm responsible to a different standard here. I'm accountable to God and I have to act differently myself. That's what's going on here.
Mm.
And so that I lose my friends in the process. And then I gain other friends, and the basis for friendship's different. So those are the main ways,
Mm-hmm.
and they're very painful. And there's a lot of regret on my part over things that I'd said and done in the past, that it took, my good new Christian friends time to explain to me,
Mm-hmm.
you're a new creature. You don't be crucifying yourself for things that you did that you can't undo. Act differently going forward by all means, but you're free from the guilt of that. That's part of the meaning of the cross for you. And so, yeah, transformative.
That's an awesome story. And I love the bit about Milton too, looking at some of the classical works and seeing what shaped Western culture really is what it sounds like.
Yep.
And that transformation leading to your own transformation, your search for the truth that ultimately would change your worldview. Is there any? I know you talk about Milton, and we mentioned that at the beginning of the video, and I'll put some. You have some lectures on it. I'll put some of those in the description on Milton specifically. But is there any other classical works that played a major role in that transformation as well, or works after the fact that maybe you when you became a Christian, you're like, wow, I haven't looked at it through this lens before, and now I see it a little differently, or
Well, I found the 17th century in general, and the turn, like from Shakespeare to Milton, that period of literature in English is so rich, and so deep. It's the period from a religious vantage point, we'll talk about Puritanism. That's what's going on there. They're all Christians, but yeah, but this is the period where Puritanism is being felt in English literature, and you can see the consequences in the way in which uh, poetry is written. So George Herbert was a huge influence on me. I took his poems and I stuck them to the wall of uh, my bedroom. They were all over the place because I found it profoundly moving and interesting and fascinating that these poems that were written for his own devotions were now used for other people in devotional ways. So George Herbert was huge for me,
hmm.
and I liked also John Donne, but that period, I loved Shakespeare as well, and I looked at Shakespeare very differently after this period, and saw so much more of Christianity in Shakespeare than I had seen before.
Hmm.
And but those are the main areas. So Milton is at the top of the pinnacle, as it were, but the others alongside him very much so. And then I discovered that there were Christians that wrote after that period that I again were engaging in ways that I thought were profoundly important and interesting, like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and T.S. Eliot and company. But the 17th century is the rich, deep period and it's because of the Puritans, and because it's application of doctrine to life.
Given sort of the legacy and impact of a lot of these classical works, within your field of English literature, how do you see academia broadly um, treating some of these classical works? Like when you went to school, I imagine there's some differences in how they would look on average at some of these classical works and the importance, or even just how they interpret and read them. Has there been a lot of changes as far as that goes within the field of English literature?
Over the course of my lifetime, there's been a uh, total 180 on in the field of literature and in the field of education in general. And that this is one of the things that I ended up realizing, that God was providentially leading me into the period of the Romantics, even though I don't like the literature, or I do like it, but I see something profoundly wrong about it, troubling. It's the shift away from Christianity towards a sort of a humanism based on human nature defining itself in in academia, and the university moving away from theology as the center of the the humanities, the center of the university. So theology was once called the queen of the sciences in the medieval. The university is a Christian institution, and but universities since the 19th century have dropped theology, literally dropped it. It's no longer taught in most universities, even though the eldest universities, even in the United States, and Harvard and Yale and Princeton, would have been started by Christians, would have an explicitly Christian theological commitment at the center of everything that they do. That has changed. They've pulled that out of the center, but it's not only that, they've moved it in a different direction. And the different direction is towards human nature as the center. But now we say that we don't even know what human nature is in the universities. There's a, it depends on your identity group perspective. That's the perspective that you take on the subject of human nature. And so what you get is this multiplicity of identity groups wanting their literature to be read in classrooms so that the next generation is educated from their perspective. And what you lose then is a loss of a common human perspective. Now, when I went to school, we still had a common human perspective. We would have read Shakespeare in schools. Um, every high school year, I read a Shakespeare play. And the texts that were read were basically liberal humanism. That liberal humanism, which Jordan Peterson talks about as well, a fair bit, is the background that he and I grew up in. We were both Canadians and had something similar of an education, and see the value in it for a view of human nature that is a common legacy, and it reflects the fact that we all bear the image of God. That that language I just used, that we all bear the image of God, you would not have heard in the 1970s. You wouldn't have heard it, but it was assumed. And so was that marriage was between one man, one woman for life. That was assumed. Those were all assumed. Now they're not only not assumed, they are being, well, I'll put it this way. The canon wars over what we read in schools and universities in the 1980s wanted to include diverse perspectives in the canon. So we'll have Shakespeare, yes, but we'll just add some female authors or some Hispanic authors or whatever. You want to add more to the canon. That was how it began. Nowadays, they want only those perspectives to be taught, and they want to exclude Shakespeare. So in California, you cannot study in the state universities Shakespeare. It's verboten. So that's the big shift, is that the identity groups that initially wanted to be added to the canon now say that the canon itself, the tradition or the patriarchy, needs to go. It has to go in order for these other voices to be heard. And the result of that is that there is just this cacophony of voices. There's no center. There's no common ground. There's no common humanity, and people treat each other appallingly in their own little, and at the same time everyone realizes that this is chaos, and so the government is coming in and saying we need uniformity to have a common culture, but we can only do that by coercion. We can't do it by persuasion anymore, appealing to common interests. We're going to have to do it from on top. And so we have this sort of globalist totalitarian impulse in education now that I'm sure everybody laments, quite frankly.
Right.
Pretty much.
It's interesting because you talked about just this movement away from patriarchy, but the opposite of patriarchy isn't matriarchy. At least it doesn't seem that way.
No.
This hyper elite globalist kind of Marxist ideas, and yeah, it's really sad that those kinds of things are happening, and you see it reflected in America. I mean, you can look at just test scores across the board, standards by which education are measured are being changed negatively to accommodate students that are performing poorly, and to say that that's a bad thing even will be assumed to be racist or something of that nature. But
well, the truth is that they've abandoned standards of truth,
right,
and if you abandon standards of truth as an educational goal, then the outcome of education is, I mean, you're getting what you want in education, which is that you're abolishing truth from the curriculum, but you cannot get good students from that. You can only get, quite frankly, propagandized um, individuals that feel strongly about certain things, but they can't argue for right or wrong. Even though they think they have right on their side, they don't even know the difference between right and wrong. They certainly can't argue it logically because they don't recognize the law of non-contradiction in logic.
Right.
So, I mean, it's total civilizational anarchy.
Right.
Uh, yeah. And again, I don't even blame, from a political point of view, people who want to say we can't allow anarchy to proceed.
Right.
There has to be law and order.
Right.
There has to be some order, because a society that's out of order is going to be a place you don't want to live. It's just totally destructive. What I realized is that the solution to this cannot come by coercion. It has to come by conviction, and conviction based on an appeal to a common good. And I see that Christ is at the center of every such enterprise, including and especially in education. That must be restored as the center. So that's my life's vocation, is to exalt Christ in the area of education. And I do think it's enormously humanizing, and it does draw all people to himself, men and women, black and white, all that is irrespective. You know, that's immaterial to the call here, because before Christ we're all sinners, each one. And that includes the gay, straight, male, female, none of it. We're all sinners. That's a category that is not mentioned in identity politics. They don't want to use that word.
Right.
They
Right.
need to use that word.
Yeah. Well, and even if they do use sinners, it'll mean it's
It means those guys, not me. Yeah.
exactly. It means the
Yeah.
oppressors, or
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's Marxist
Exactly.
terminology. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel. There's so many things that we could talk about on this, but instead of going down all those rabbit holes, I'm going to give you a playlist, one with some of the videos that we mentioned earlier, but also his channel. He has tons of lectures that I would encourage you to look at, where he goes through uh, what we've talked about today in much more detail. And so I encourage you to check those out. Thanks so much for coming on the channel today.
Thank you very much, Mike.